But without further ado, let's go to old friend of the show, Senator Johnny Isakson, Republican from the great state of Georgia, currently serving on the committees for HELP, that's HELP, ranking member of Employment and Workplace Safety Subcommittee, also Foreign Relations, Commerce, Ethics, and Veterans Affairs Committee. What time do you have for yourself, Senator Isakson? How are you today?
Alan, I always make time for you.
I appreciate that. Now, listen, sometimes I like to say, we can't see the forest of clarity for the trees of minutia. So I'd like you to walk us through what I just teased folks about. It has to do, again, with whether or not the National Mediation Board indeed violated the latest legislation that was conjured for their edification, if you will, the FAA Modernization and Reform Act. Wondering if they're violating it in favor of unions, because apparently, if I understand correctly, all they're saying is necessary for a union to get their act accepted as a bona fide union is 35% in support versus 50%. And this all hinges on whether or not a merger of groups were involved. Give us a little more on this if you can.
Well, let me give you the background. National Mediation Board oversees all unionization in all transportation, railroad, airlines, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. We did the FAA modernization bill as a member of the Commerce Committee and one that's worked hard for a fair but not unbalanced labor law in aviation. I proposed a number of amendments, one of which was to raise the threshold for calling a union vote in an airline from 35% of the workers to 50% of the workers. That was accepted by the Conference Committee, was adopted by the House and by the Senate. Now there are those trying to say, yes, but that didn't apply to a pre-passage merger, and there was only one, and that was Delta and Northwest Airlines. So they're trying to say that in the case of Delta and Northwest, the threshold remains at 35 because the law passed after that merger took place. But that's just trying to figure out a way to not make the tougher number, 50% versus 35, apply.
Well, isn't that 50% predicated, isn't the assumption that the 50% doesn't apply something that was predicated on merely a colloquy in the congressional record? That's nothing more than documented conversation. It doesn't have anything to do with binding law, yet still the NMB, the National Mediation Board, came to the conclusion that the colloquy was indeed enough grounds on which to predicate that assertion. But you and I know a colloquy is not binding law.
No, it's like saying a minority opinion of the Supreme Court, a majority opinion of the Supreme Court. It just doesn't happen.
So how do they get away with that? How can they reach beyond their statutory authority? I mean, this is tantamount to passing legislation that, in fact, was not passed.
Well, unfortunately, throughout the administration that's currently in charge in any number of divisions and departments and bureaucracies, they're attempting to legislate through regulation and avoid the legislation of the Senate and the House. This is just another example of that. The EPA has done the same thing. The Labor Department's done the same thing. They're all trying to legislate through regulation, which is not their way to do it.
But, Congressman, Senator, I apologize. To me, this is rather vexing. Look, as you're familiar with the show, I'll agree with the conservatives in that I'm for smaller government, lower taxes, originalist judges. I supported the war in Iraq, the war against fanatical jihadists. But I'm also a social progressive, pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-gay marriage, pro-social safety nets. I'm not a right-winger here, but even I'm amazingly offended at this president for how he has just so breathtakingly decided to violate the Constitution, seemingly with impunity. A quick reference, just to get off subject for a moment here, has to do with when he came up with this recess appointment of Richard Cordray to head the Consumer Protection Bureau. And Senator, you and I both know that was according to every single measure, a blatant violation of the Constitution. I mean, neither house, if I'm looking at the Constitution right now, neither house during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any place than that in which the two houses shall be sitting. Now, he made this recess appointment, and his excuse was because, well, we can't do anything about a do-nothing Congress. But when I look at this passage, Congressman, this means that before the Senate can adjourn for more than 3 days, it requires the consent of the House. But that never happened, did it?
No, and listen, Alan, let me tell you, talking about recess appointments and talking about labor, Craig Becker was named head of the National Labor Relations Board after the Senate had denied confirmation under advice and consent. The president waited till a recess and then made a recess appointment to a man who was the principal counsel for the AFL-CIO for 25 years. The administration has a bent towards organized labor, the SEIU, the AFL-CIO, And when you see the NLRB or the National Mediation Board rule, like we've been talking about in this case, it's more to tilt things towards favor of organized labor.
I know, but in my estimation, a lot of these things can be unfortunately argued in the blurry areas. People can take, the absence of definitive explanation and use it as an out clause. But as it relates to what you guys are trying to do, keep the the National Mediation Board honest, you're pointing out the text that they're deliberately ignoring. You make it abundantly clear that there is no wiggle room for what was supposed to be 50% to be dropped to 35%. And the merger mention is spurious as grounds because that was only referenced, again, as we said, as a colloquy, not as binding law. How do you guys plan to get around this?
Well, Senator Orrin Hatch, who's the ranking member of the Finance Committee, Senator Mike Enzi, who's the ranking member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Subcommittee, and myself as the ranking member of the subcommittee have all written to the NLRB saying, you are wrong. We negotiated this settlement. We made the amendment. It passed the House and the Senate. The law now says 50%, and no colloquy can overturn an act of the Congress.
Now, what leverage do you have to preempt this from going forward, as they seem to indicate they're going to? I mean, aside from taking them to court, and, of course, that might not be soon enough if they hopefully lose, if the administration loses.
Well, we also have the ability to file a reconciliation resolution to cause them to come back and reconsider the regulation they passed. If we can get a majority of 51 senators to do that, which would mean we'd have to get 4 Democrats to come across, then we could overturn it through that.
You can, and that's always been available since the 30s, but it's very rarely been done. Isn't that fair to say? We
tried it 4 times this year and failed each time, generally on a party line vote. But it is an avenue that we would pursue first before we went to court.
One thing I have to ask you just before we get out, and this has been something bugging me for a while now. Let me see if I can get it from you. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the Constitution as it relates to the question surrounding Richard Cordray, the one who was appointed to head the Consumer Protection Bureau, it was a recess appointment made during a time when Congress was not in recess. Again, as I said earlier, the Constitution says neither House during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the 2 houses shall be sitting. Now, Senator, again, this means that before the Senate can adjourn for more than 3 days, even adjourn, it requires the consent of the House. But that never happened, did it? And to be exact, if you can't adjourn for more than 3 days, you sure as hell can't have a congressional recess, because that recess is inextricably contingent upon adjournment.
Exactly 100% dead on correct.
Thank you. Glad we had this chat. So what are you guys going to do about it?
We're going to keep fighting and hopefully win a victory in November and change the tune in Washington.
We want to see that, but will anything more legalistically be done against this president who denotatively and connotatively has violated our founding document on point, Senator?
We will try every way we can to hold the administration and the chief executive accountable for their actions under the Constitution of the United States.
Well, I look forward to seeing those efforts in the future, and count on this show for whatever additional platform and voice you may require. Senator Johnny Isakson, a Republican from the great state of Georgia.